Yeah, I've seen a lot of different ways to use indicators today. It's interesting. This is probably very different to what you've been doing with less of a health aspect and more of a well-being focus. I guess the reason we got into this space in the first place is really around our compliance and enforcement review. So in 2010 and 2009, and a few years before that too, we've had various reports that weren't very complimentary of EPA and the way we operated. I guess there was a widespread view amongst the community that we lost our focus in environmental regulation. So we had a review done of all of our compliance enforcement activities, and what ended up was 119 recommendations. Most of those have been completed or acted on in some way. This project that incorporated indicators is one of those. So we're really tasked to look at where there were disproportionate environmental impacts on vulnerable communities, and the environmental side of that was the disproportionate impacts on sensitive receiving environments, and that might be marine national parks and things like that. So it's a different topic. So we had to work out a few things first. What were the environmental impacts? One of the things EPA has a lot of trouble with the well-being type problems. So where there's odour impacts, where there's noise impacts. So we still regulate those things, but they're not directly. They'll probably, well, you say odour might kill you depending on what it is, but the chances are it's probably not. And we often don't get the same buy-in from enforcement activities, whether it's in court or in VCAT, that we do when there's an obvious health effect from air quality or some other kind of toxic pollutant that, it's obviously bad for you. So I guess that's where we've got to head in terms of the evidence base in trying to work out what is important to the community in terms of well-being, and how do we address this in terms of an evidence base, and when the next works approval comes up to us, so we're ready to take that on. The other issues, of course, we had to work with CIV on. It's a bit out of our area of expertise, was defining those communities as well. What were we looking at in terms of community? So we found that there are spatial correlations between the self-reported odour complaints to our EPA hotline, noise and air complaints as well. Really proximity to source generally, and you'll see some maps come up soon that show that pretty clearly. We've based, so I guess to predict the future, we had to work out what the past looked like. So we based our initial study on reports from 2008 to 2011 from our EPA, I guess the pollution reporting hotline. That stage it wasn't 24 hours, it is now, but so it was a little bit less accessible than it is now, but it's still a really good data set to build on. We looked at a number of sort of social demographic indicators and health up front. So two of those were based on CIV Vic Health data. So that was the self-reported health and citizen engagement. And we felt that, the self-reported health was a good proxy for actual health outcomes, and the citizen engagement would get a feel for whether that area was particularly engaged or not. The age was particularly important to air quality. We did look at air quality as well, and so anyone less than 15 years of age or greater than 65 is seen to be more vulnerable to health impacts from air quality. Low income was an obvious one just to look at. English language proficiency, so that's an ABS statistic, it actually turned out to be very important, and you'll see that, and of course the socioeconomic indices for areas. We looked at those as well.
Retrospectively to the areas that you saw were doing high reporting.
Yeah.
Or you did this. Yeah.
Yeah. So you'll see.
The data that had already been collected and correlated that with your.
Yeah, with what we saw with the social indicators. So yeah. So we looked at that for all 79 because we're Victoria based. We wanted to look at it for all 79 at a first pass. 79 incorporated LGAs. 3 stood out, so they were Kingston, Hobsons Bay and Central Goldfields. and they stood out for various reasons to do with the industrial estates generally. Hobson's Bay, well know where that is, I'd imagine. Yeah, so the general finding for the socio-spatial relationship was that where there was low citizen engagement, low self-reported health, there were more people that were younger than 15 or probably more greater than 65, lower income and less English language proficiency, there tended to be more of these type of complaints. That was generally across the board. In some areas, we had lots of complaints, but their indicators were the opposite. So this really, we tried to look at things as an LGA, but it doesn't give you that level of detail because we've got very active communities in some parts, and then other areas, and be outside of a landfill, for example, they're not nearly as active. So why is that? They're not being impacted? Is it environmental? You'll see an example of that in just a moment. So we'll start with a case study, which will show this more clearly. So this is sort of the, I guess you like to say, the landfill belt of Melbourne. There's probably 6 or 7 landfills in various stages of activity. Some of them are closed. Some of them still actively accepting waste. So we looked at it first from a citizen engagement point of view. So the darker colour tends to indicate there was more citizen engagement. So this is by LGA at this stage. The red hashed areas are industrial areas and the orange areas are the landfills. You'll see in the middle there. And the purple dots are the odour complaints. So just for reference, between 2008 and 2011, I think for the Kingston LGA, there was over 1,000 complaints, I think, for that period, so it's quite a lot. And you can see there, what's interesting is Bayside had that high level of engagement. You move towards Greater Dandenong and that shifted. You can see it more clearly here with just the complaints and the striped areas in orange being the licensed landfills. There are some former landfills in that area too. So the self-reported health, and again the Bayside area tended to produce a high level of people saying they had excellent or very good health, I think it was, through to Kingston and then Greater Dandenong. There's this sort of gradient there. So that told us at a high level maybe Kingston was an area to look at, and obviously Greater Dandenong was as well. But we needed to know around those landfills what exactly was happening. So we went down a level into SA1 codes from the ABS statistics. So this was income. So the darker areas are lower, a higher percentage of lower income. That's ranked across the state as well. So you can see around some of the landfill areas and in the bottom right corner there for Greater Dandenong, there are some areas that are quite obviously a higher percentage of lower income earners than, say, Bayside and along the coast there. That was one element. But what was the most striking was English language proficiency. So this is where there's a percentage of people that answered the English language proficiency question on the 2011 ABS survey that they didn't speak English well or at all. And in some cases, I think the red area is 17 to 50% or something like that. It's quite large. So you can see there, I think this is a really clear indication of where we get complaints in that the southeastern section there around Dingley Village, where their indicators are quite different from across the road in Springvale, and we're not getting many complaints there at all. Yet the prevailing winds would suggest that they should almost be more highly impacted than anybody else. So anyone northeast of the landfills, given the southwesterly winds normally, should be impacted more. But again, that we're looking into that as to whether there was an environmental factor in that, being north winds being often being hotter days and more odour being created. So it's complicated, but it's a first cut and the first idea that, well, even with a set of landfill or even a landfill or a composting facility that's creating odour, it could be wildly different characteristics of the community from one side to the other. So you don't know what you're dealing with. So it was a good example and something we're looking into in an R&D project in more detail. And again, this is socio-economic indicators for areas. We looked at the three main ones, which were the index of economic resources, education and occupation, and relative disadvantage. So this was economic resources, and you can see there in the red coloured areas, they're the lower deciles, so that was broken up into deciles. So again, north of the landfills there, you see quite a belt of communities in the lower deciles. Education and occupation follows much the same, and relative disadvantage is also quite similar between Clayton South and the greater Dandenong area. So obviously what that would indicate is if we're targeting compliance and enforcement areas, we don't want to just be looking at the Dingley Village area. We might need to be looking at Springvale and all kinds of other areas. And what does that tell us about landfills in other parts of the state too? Does that mean just because we're not receiving a heap of reports out of those facilities, does that mean the odour is not an issue, or does it mean they're just not reporting it? And how do we target our compliance effort to deal with that? So there were a few recommendations that came out of the CIV work around planning laws, legislation, and I guess the buffer distances, and we have a lot of trouble enforcing buffer distances, and our landfill best practice documents suggest that no one should be living within 500 metres of these landfills, but that's certainly not the case. And as in case you would probably know, Helen Road is nowhere near that. And yeah, we do have real trouble in enforcing that, and that's probably because sometimes the well-being aspects of odour are never considered properly. We don't have the evidence base to say, well, hang on, we see in the reports, and when you read the reports, some of them are really, really very descriptive, and it's hard to read, basically.
So what evidence would that 500 exclusion zone be based on then? Why would they have said that in the first place?
They would base that. We do modelling around odour, and they would most likely. These facilities aren't supposed to generate any odour beyond the boundary, but we know that's also not particularly realistic and hard to enforce. They would probably have based that around odour modelling. There are other reasons too, gas, landfill gas, migration, things like that, but I think it's mainly around odour that they set that such a long distance. There is, but it's a health. It's more of a well-being. Yeah. So you're not. I mean, they've done characteristics of gas coming from landfills, and there's a wide range of chemical compounds, but none of them were particularly toxic. I think they did that around Dandenong South. So then you lose your it's going to kill you argument if you live there for too long. It's really that you can't stand living there because it stinks, and it's pride of place, and it's all that kind of stuff. And I think odour complaints make up around 50% of our total complaint. Yeah.
Whereas carcinogenic gas, it's going to cause cancer, you can prove it.
Yeah, but I was just wondering why there was a 500 metres in the first place.
From memory, that was set on odour-related issues. It tend to be how they set those. Again, I think I've just added in brackets some of the things we've been looking at in terms of the recommendations that came out of this work, and I guess more power to enforce monitoring and assessment, but also better targeted compliance. So where we know that there's problems, we want to go out in there and be on top of that, really. One thing that we've noted, but probably still aren't doing particularly well, is in the non-English language areas, to try and engage with the community leaders a bit more. So I think one good thing that's come out of this is our strategic partnerships group have really recognised that now. So I think they'll consider that in future engagement, especially around works approvals and things like that. Incentives including market-based instruments. Organic waste is a good example of this, where we've got a broken market effectively. the people who take the waste, they don't have any market standards or anything. Their products are, vary wildly. Their management of it varies wildly. So, what can we do in that space to help that along so everyone's sort of complying? And that also comes to better recycling facilities. So I think they say about 60% of the waste going to landfill is organic still. Probably most of that's probably municipal. But how do we divert that? But divert that in a way that doesn't create an odour problem for somebody else. And that's not an easy thing to solve. And it's one of our top 6 focus areas at the moment. So I guess we found that spatial correlation between industrial sites, whether it be composters, broiler farms or another source of odour, landfills are of course the big one. And with the air quality we found slightly different because everyone's affected by poor air quality. It's in a much wider range. And basically there were really with the air quality issues are probably more around industrial facilities, so like Brooklyn, Hobson's Bay was a good example of that, where there's a lot of dust and generated from a local industry. So they're more impacted than everyone else. Francis Street in Yarraville was another one where large numbers of trucks, so they're therefore more impacted than the general community. How do we tackle that? How do we know where it's happening now? We don't know where it might be happening tomorrow or where we should be looking. So there's lots of further research to be done. I think we've only just started the journey with this in a lot of ways. So we can identify the areas from the past. It'd be good to be able to look into the future a little bit more and see where there's more work to be done in terms of targeting compliance. We've also got an encroachment. One of our top 6 focus areas is encroachment also, so looking at residential encroachment on odorous facilities particularly, and how in some of those cases, say landfills, it's hard to move a landfill. Do we need to, where do we put them? Nobody wants them, so we've got one operating. And if it's operating well, do we need to protect that from residential encroachment? Do we see that as a piece of infrastructure that we need? How are we going to cope with that? Because simply building around it and ignoring the consequences hasn't worked for us in the past. So, how do we be proactive in that space and get into the planning and the rest of it? Again, CIV has been a really good partnership. We couldn't have come up with the findings we did without them. So we'd like to think that we continue building this evidence base, and maybe we provide CIV with environmental data to match up with the rest of it, which you can all use. I mean, that would be the goal from our point of view. There's a long way to go and to get people to release some of this data, but we'll get there and chip away at it. But it's certainly things like the data vic policy, which says we should be releasing data, state government wide helps. We just got to de-identify some of these complaints and things like that. We'll get there, I think. That's about all I had to say.